A maid dropped her ring. A Mafia boss picked it up and froze. He had given that ring to a girl years ago with a promise he never kept. What she didn't know, the stranger standing in front of her, was that same boy. The children at St. Catherine's orphanage had a rule. When the black cars came, you disappeared. Not because anyone told them to. Nobody ever had to. Kids who grew up without parents learned fast. Men in expensive suits who never smiled didn't come to places like this to be kind. They came because they wanted something. And in the south side of Chicago, want and danger were the same word. So when 3 black SUVs rolled through the cracked iron gate on a gray Tuesday morning, the hallways of St. Catherine's emptied like smoke. All except one. Lila Carter had learned to be invisible a long time ago. Not the kind of invisible that meant hiding, the kind that meant moving through a room so quietly, so efficiently, that people looked right past you. Mop in hand, bucket at her feet, she worked her way down the dim ground floor corridor. The one that always smelled of old wood and something that could have been cinnamon if you were optimistic enough. She was 24 years old, and she had been cleaning these same floors since she was 17. First, as a resident, then, when she aged out and had nowhere else to go, as staff. The orphanage was the only home she had ever known, and she stayed not because she had no choice, but because the children here deserved at least one person who wasn't going anywhere. She wrung out the mop and pushed it forward, eyes down. That's when she heard the footsteps. Different from the usual. Too measured, too deliberate. Like someone who had trained themselves never to make a sound, but couldn't quite kill the habit of authority. She kept her head down. Invisible. A trick that worked on almost everyone. Almost.
"This wing hasn't been renovated yet."
A man's voice. Low, flat. The kind of voice that didn't ask questions even when it was asking one. Lila glanced up just enough to register a tailored charcoal suit, dark hair, and the sort of stillness that made the air around a person feel different. She looked back down. "No," she said quietly. "Not yet." He didn't move on. That was the odd thing. Men like him always moved on. Lila straightened slightly and tucked a loose strand of dark hair behind her ear. And that's when it happened. The ring slipped. It had always been slightly too large, a problem she'd had for 7 years, ever since she'd found it tucked inside her old pillowcase when she turned 17, a relic from childhood she hadn't even known she'd kept. She'd worn it on her right hand every single day since, the metal worn smooth, the silver gone slightly dull, but she never once considered taking it off. The ring hit the hardwood floor with a sound barely louder than a breath. It rolled, the way small, round things always did in the worst possible direction, straight toward the man in the suit. He stopped it with the toe of one polished shoe. A beat passed. Then he crouched down, picked it up between 2 fingers, and held it to the thin light coming through the corridor window. Lila moved toward him, hand already out. "Sorry, it slips sometimes." She stopped, because he had gone completely still. Not the stillness of a man examining jewelry, something else entirely. His eyes were locked on the ring with an expression she couldn't read. Not quite recognition, not quite shock. Something underneath both of those things, something older and unwilling to surface. "Sir?" She kept her voice level. "Could I have that back?" He didn't answer for 3 full seconds. When he finally looked up at her, Lila felt a strange, uncomfortable pull, like standing at a window in winter and feeling the cold come through the glass without it ever opening. His eyes were dark, unreadable, and absolutely certain of something she wasn't. He turned the ring once more in his fingers, and she saw it. A tiny scratch along the inner band, thin as a hair, shaped almost like a crooked letter. She'd always assumed it was a manufacturing flaw. She had never wondered what it might have been instead. He placed the ring in her palm carefully, his expression already sealed back behind whatever wall he lived behind. "It's old," he said, not a question. "Yes." She closed her fingers around it. "Someone gave it to me a long time ago." Something moved across his face so fast she almost missed it. Almost.
"Must have meant something to you," he said, "if you still wear it."
Lila looked down at the ring in her hand, then back up at him. But he had already turned away, already walking, already becoming the kind of man who moved through rooms like they owed him passage. "It did," she said, to his back, to the empty hallway, to no one in particular. "He was the only person who ever made me feel like I wasn't invisible." She slipped the ring back onto her finger and returned to her mop. Down the hall, Alexander Moreno kept walking. His hands, for the first time in 11 years, were not entirely steady. Alexander Moreno did not rattle. That was the thing people said about him, the thing that made grown men lower their voices when his name came up in certain rooms. Not that he was ruthless, though he was. Not that he was smart, though that too. It was the stillness, the absolute, unnerving calm that sat behind his eyes, no matter what was happening in front of them. He had watched a man pull a gun on him across a dinner table and finished his meal first. He had received news of a warehouse fire, $3 million of product gone in an hour, and responded by pouring himself a second glass of scotch. Control was not something Alex practiced. It was something he had been forged into, the way steel was forged, by heat and pressure, and the decision to either break or become harder than the thing trying to break you. So the fact that his hands had trembled, barely, almost invisibly, but trembled, after handing back a $5 ring to a woman in a hallway, was something he did not know what to do with. He sat in the back of the SUV and said nothing for the entire 40-minute drive back to downtown Chicago. Marco, his right-hand man, sat in the passenger seat and had the good sense not to speak. 15 years at Alex's side had taught him to read the silences, and this one was the kind that had weight. The penthouse occupied the top 2 floors of a glass tower overlooking Lake Michigan. Everything in it was chosen for function and controlled impression. Dark surfaces, clean lines, nothing sentimental, nothing soft. Visitors sometimes called it cold. Alex called it honest. Comfort was a lie you told yourself when you had something to lose. He had spent a long time making sure he had nothing to lose. He poured a scotch he didn't drink and stood at the floor-to-ceiling window. The city sprawled below him like a circuit board, all light and grid and motion. The ring. He closed his eyes. It had been a cheap thing. He remembered buying it, stealing it, if honesty mattered, which it sometimes did, from a vendor's cart outside a gas station on West Garfield Boulevard. He'd been 12 years old, with 40 cents in his pocket, and a philosophy that the world owed him at least one small mercy. The vendor had been distracted. The ring had been right there. He'd given it to her the same afternoon. She'd been crying behind the kitchen, the old kitchen, the one with the broken radiator that hissed all winter. He hadn't asked why. He hadn't known how. So he'd just held out the ring and said the only thing that came to him, the way kids sometimes said true things because they didn't yet know better. "I'll marry you when we grow up." She'd laughed. Then she'd put it on. He opened his eyes. The city blinked back at him, indifferent. He had run away from St. Catherine's at 14. Not from her, not specifically, but the result was the same. The streets had taken him in the way the streets took everyone with nowhere else to go. Badly, then usefully, then permanently. By 16, he was running errands for a man named Devlin, who controlled 3 South Side blocks. By 19, Devlin was gone, and Alex had 3 blocks of his own. He had not let himself think about the orphanage, about anyone in it. Survival required that kind of deletion. "Marco." His voice was even. It always was. Marco appeared in the doorway within seconds. "Boss." "The maid at St. Catherine's. Her name is Lila Carter." He paused. "I want everything. Quietly. No one else asks. No one else knows." Marco nodded once. How deep? Deep enough to know if she's who I think she is. The file arrived before midnight. Alex sat at his desk and read it the way he read everything. Quickly, completely, and with the particular attention of a man who understood that small details were where the truth liked to hide. Lila Marie Carter. Born Chicago, exact birth date unknown, recorded only as approximately late autumn, which was the orphanage's way of saying no one had been there for the actual moment. She had arrived at St. Catherine's at age 3, origin unknown, no identified family. She had remained as a resident until age 17, then as a part-time cleaner, then full-time staff. She had never left. Not really. She worked a second job at a cafe on Halsted Street, Tuesday through Saturday, 6 to 10 in the evening. She had a small apartment 4 blocks from the orphanage, a library card, and a nearly perfect record of rent paid on time, despite the math that required 2 jobs to make possible. No criminal record, no known associations. No one special in her life, as far as the file showed, which, for a man like Alex, meant the file was probably accurate. And then, the detail he'd been looking for, buried on the second page like it was nothing. Previous resident of St. Catherine's. Period of stay, age 3 through 17, overlapping with the period 1998 to 2008. He had left in 2007. She had been there. He leaned back in his chair and let that land the way it needed to. All those years. She had stayed in that building, the same floors, the same walls, the same cracked window in the east corridor that no one ever fixed. And she had kept the ring, worn it even, as a memory of a boy she thought was dead, while he had spent 17 years building an empire on top of everything he'd buried. The unfairness of it settled in his chest like cold water. He thought about what she'd said in the hallway. Someone gave it to me a long time ago. The way she'd said it, not sad exactly, but careful. The way people spoke about things that were precious, precisely because they were the only evidence that a certain moment had been real. She had preserved a piece of him he'd thrown away himself, and she had no idea who he was. His name, his real name, the name the streets had taken and rebuilt, meant nothing to her. The boy she remembered had been scrawny and 12 and had no last name worth keeping. She knew a ghost. He knew a crime boss. Neither version was the truth. Neither version was a lie. He picked up the file and then set it back down. The smart move was obvious. Walk away. She was safe. She was intact. She had built something small but real. And the moment he stepped any further into her life, that changed. People around Alex had a pattern. They got pulled in, and then they got used. He had never lost sleep over that pattern before. The ring, the scratch, the way her face had looked when she closed her hand around it, like holding something alive. He reached for his phone and typed a single message to Marco. Find out if the renovation at St. Catherine's East Wing is still scheduled. He stared at the message before sending it. He was going back. He knew it was reckless. He knew his world had no room for sentiment, that every man who had ever let something soft through his armor had paid for it eventually. He had watched it happen to better men than him. He sent the message anyway. And for the first time in more years than he could count, Alexander Moreno did not sleep. The renovation excuse was thin. Alex knew it. Marco knew it. The foreman, who received a call at 7 in the morning, instructing him to schedule an on-site inspection with 40 minutes' notice, definitely knew it. But no one said anything because that was also how Alex's world worked. Questions were a luxury reserved for people who weren't on his payroll. He arrived at St. Catherine's at 9:15. This time, no convoy, just a single car, Marco driving, and Alex in the passenger seat instead of the back. A small thing that would have meant nothing to anyone else, and meant everything to anyone who knew him. The back seat was distance. The front seat was a man trying, even slightly, to be ordinary. He told himself it was reconnaissance. He was good at telling himself things. The East Wing renovation was real enough. He'd been quietly funding St. Catherine's operating costs for 3 years through a shell company called Meridian Property Holdings, and the East Wing ceiling had needed work since before that. He stood with the foreman for 20 minutes, asked the right questions, nodded at the right answers, and let the man believe this visit was about load-bearing walls and waterproof sealant. Then the foreman went back to his crew, and Alex stayed. He moved through the orphanage the way he moved through every space, reading it. The layout, the wear patterns, the places where paint was freshest and oldest. The crayon drawings taped crookedly along the corridor walls. A row of small shoes by the back door, lined up with the particular imprecision of children doing their best. He came around the corner of the main hall and stopped. Lila was sitting cross-legged on the floor of the common room, surrounded by 4 children, 3 of them under the age of 7, one closer to 10 who was clearly trying to appear too old for whatever was happening, but failing completely. She had a picture book open across her knees and was reading aloud in different voices, a different one for each character, completely unself-conscious about it. The youngest child, a girl with 2 uneven pigtails, had climbed halfway into her lap without asking, and Lila had simply adjusted the book and kept reading. Alex stood in the doorway for a moment longer than he intended. He had spent 17 years reading people, their weaknesses, their angles, the specific texture of what they wanted and what they feared. It was the skill that had kept him alive and ahead. And what he saw in that room was something his particular skill set had almost no language for. She wasn't performing kindness. She wasn't managing the children or maintaining them. She was just present, fully and without condition. The 10-year-old finally noticed Alex standing in the doorway and straightened up immediately, the universal reflex of a child who had learned that adult strangers meant uncertainty. Lila followed his gaze. Her expression shifted, not into fear, not quite, but into the careful neutrality of someone making a quick assessment. "The foreman is in the East Wing," she said, polite, even, a clear invitation to go somewhere else. "I know," Alex said. "I already spoke with him." A beat. "Can I help you with something?" "No." He looked at the room rather than at her. "Don't let me interrupt." She watched him for one more second, the look of someone deciding whether to push, then turned back to the book. He moved away down the corridor before she could decide. He came back to the building 2 more times that day on increasingly unconvincing pretexts. By the 3rd visit, he was fairly certain Lila had noticed, because she started moving through the orphanage with the particular efficiency of someone who was very deliberately not looking in a specific direction. At 4:50 in the afternoon, she pulled on a jacket and left through the back door. Alex gave it 3 minutes, then followed. She walked fast, head slightly down, bag over one shoulder, the specific walking pace of someone who had places to be and no margin for delay. He kept a full block between them, far enough to be invisible, close enough to maintain the thread. She turned onto Halstead Street and pushed through the glass door of a cafe called Blue Heron without pausing, the way people entered places they didn't think about anymore because they'd entered them 500 times before. Alex stopped on the opposite side of the street. The cafe was the kind of place that had probably been someone's dream. Mismatched chairs, local artwork on exposed brick walls, a chalkboard menu with too many fonts. It was full enough for a Wednesday evening. Through the window, he watched Lila tie an apron behind her back as she greeted the woman at the counter, and then slide into the rhythm of a second shift the way she'd slid into the first. Quietly, completely, without any apparent sense that 2 jobs and no breathing room was an unreasonable way to live. He stood there longer than was sensible. Then he went inside. She saw him the moment he walked through the door. Something in her posture changed, a barely perceptible straightening, the adjustment of someone recalibrating. She said something to a colleague and approached the counter where he'd taken a seat, order pad in hand, face arranged into the careful, professional expression of someone who had decided to treat an unusual situation with maximum normalcy. "You followed me," she said. Not an accusation, a statement of fact, delivered quietly so only he could hear it. "I came for coffee," Alex said. "You walked a block behind me for 8 minutes." "I walk slowly." She looked at him with a particular expression of a person who was not, under any circumstances, going to be charmed by that. "What do you actually want?" It was the most direct thing anyone had said to him in recent memory. People in his world didn't speak to him that way. They approached him from angles, through intermediaries, with careful preamble. She had just asked him a straight question and was waiting for a straight answer, order pad still in hand. He found, unexpectedly, that he didn't entirely hate it. "Coffee," he said again. "Black." She wrote it down, possibly just to have something to do with her hands, and then looked back up. "You were watching me this morning, in the common room." "Yes." "Why?" He considered several answers and discarded all of them. "You were good with the kids," he said finally. "It was notable." Something changed slightly in her expression, not softened exactly, but adjusted. "Most people who fund places like St. Catherine's don't come to inspect the staff," she said. "They inspect the receipts." Alex looked at her carefully. She'd done the math. She'd connected Meridian Holdings to him, or at least to this visit, which meant she was sharper than the quiet exterior suggested, and she had done it without making a performance of it. "Most staff members at orphanages don't work a second job until 10 at night," he replied. "Most people don't have a choice about how hard they work." The coffee arrived, placed in front of him by a colleague because Lila hadn't moved. They were still looking at each other with the careful attention of two people who had each recognized, without being able to explain why, that this conversation was something other than ordinary. "You look familiar," she said finally, quietly, almost to herself. The words landed somewhere behind his ribs. "I get that sometimes," he said. She studied him for one more moment, searching almost, then shook her head slightly, as if dismissing a thought that didn't quite hold together. "I'll check back on your coffee," she said, and moved away. Alex wrapped both hands around the cup. She thought he looked familiar. She was remembering a 12-year-old boy with no money and a stolen ring and a promise he hadn't earned the right to make. He was sitting across from her as the man that boy had been forced to become. The distance between those two versions of himself had never felt longer, or more like a problem he wasn't sure he could solve. He came back the next evening. Not to the orphanage this time, straight to Blue Heron, 8:15, the midpoint of her shift when the dinner rush thinned and the cafe settled into the quieter rhythm of people nursing drinks and avoiding going home. He took the same seat at the counter, ordered the same coffee. Lila appeared in front of him with the resigned expression of someone who had already decided to stop being surprised. "You again." "Me again," he confirmed. She set the coffee down without being asked, which meant she'd made it before he'd had a chance to order, which meant she'd seen him come through the door and prepared for him anyway, which meant she had been expecting him even if she hadn't wanted to be. He filed that away. "I'm not interesting," she said. "Whatever it is you're trying to figure out, I promise the answer isn't worth this many visits." "I'll decide what's worth my time." "That's a very arrogant thing to say." "Yes," he agreed. She looked at him the way people looked at things that didn't behave the way they were supposed to, slightly frustrated, slightly involuntarily curious. Then a customer called from the far end of the cafe and she moved away, and Alex sat with his coffee and waited. This was something he was exceptionally good at. Waiting. She came back 20 minutes later, during a quiet stretch, and refilled his cup without asking. He took that as permission. "How long have you worked there?" he asked. "St. Catherine's." She considered whether to answer. Then, 7 years as staff, 14 before that as a resident. She kept her voice matter-of-fact, the tone of someone who had made peace with a story a long time ago and no longer needed softness around it. "You stayed." "I stayed."
Most people leave.
She looked at him with something that wasn't quite a smile. Most people have somewhere to leave too. He had walked out of that building at 14 with nothing but a direction, away, and had never once looked back. She had stayed and built a life out of the very thing he'd run from. He didn't say any of that. He turned his coffee cup once on the counter.
The ring,
he said. It came out more direct than he'd planned. He had meant to approach it sideways, work toward it slowly, but something about her bluntness made performance feel wasteful. Lila's hand moved, involuntary, small, toward her right hand, where the ring sat on her finger. Then she stopped herself. What about it?
Yesterday, when it fell,
he kept his voice measured. You looked, he searched for the right word.
Scared, just for a second, before you got it back.
She was quiet for a moment. Around them, the cafe hummed with low music and other people's conversations. It's the only thing I have from before, she said finally.
Before what?
Before I understood that most things don't last. He held that sentence still inside himself and didn't let it show on his face.
Someone gave it to you, he said.
Not a question. She'd told him that much in the corridor, and he needed her to know he'd remembered, that it wasn't nothing. Lila leaned against the counter slightly, and he saw the exact moment she decided that this strange man, with his expensive suit and his unsettling stillness, had, for reasons she couldn't yet categorize, been allocated a small amount of her honesty. A boy, she said. We were both kids. He lived at St. Catherine's, too.
How old were you?
10, maybe? 11? She looked at the ring rather than at him. We were both hungry, properly hungry, not just missing lunch. Someone had shorted the kitchen supplies that week, and dinner had been half what it should have been. I was upset. I wasn't crying. I don't really... She paused. I don't cry in front of people. But I was upset. Alex remembered the broken radiator, the hissing, the cold. He found me behind the kitchen, she continued. Didn't ask any questions, which was unusual. Most kids, if they found you upset, they either ignored it or made it worse. He just came and sat next to me. And then, after a minute, he held out this ring. A small sound, almost a laugh, but quieter than that. It was obviously stolen. The tag was still on it. Alex looked down at his cup. He said he'd marry me when we grew up. She said it simply, without embarrassment, because enough years had passed to transform even the most tender moments into something that could be held at a slight distance. I thought he was ridiculous. We were children living in an orphanage. But I put it on anyway.
And then?
He asked, though he already knew.
He disappeared.
The two words were flat, but not empty. The flatness of something that had been felt so many times it had worn smooth.
A couple years later, 14, 15, that age when boys sometimes just vanish. Some of them age out, some of them find other ways out. She turned the ring slowly on her finger. No one told me anything. I assumed for a long time that something bad had happened. The South Side in those years.
She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. You never took it off, Alex said.
I know how that sounds.
It doesn't sound like anything except what it is. She glanced at him, briefly, with the particular look of someone recalibrating, because a response wasn't what they'd prepared for. Then she straightened up. He was the first person who treated me like I was worth something, she said. Not charity, not a problem to be managed, just worth something. That's a very small thing when you have everything. When you have nothing, it's the only thing. She paused. I kept the ring to remind myself that someone had done that, even once, even for 5 minutes behind a kitchen. Alex was absolutely still. He had spent 17 years constructing a version of himself that needed nothing and no one, and it had worked. It had worked well, had produced an empire and a reputation and a kind of safety that orphan 12-year-olds could not imagine. But the architecture of that construction required burying certain rooms completely, not visiting them, not even acknowledging that the doors existed. She had just opened one. She had been keeping a piece of him alive in her memory, the best piece, the only piece that had ever acted without calculation, while he had buried it so thoroughly he'd almost convinced himself it had never existed. And she was telling a stranger at a cafe counter about it, not knowing the stranger was the room she'd kept unlocked all this time. The unfairness of it sat in his chest like something physical. He looked up at her, and for one terrifying second felt the words rise. It was me. I was the boy. I didn't die. I just became something you would never have recognized. And he stopped them. Not yet. The moment he said those words, everything changed. Her life touched his, and everything his life touched eventually got burned. "He sounds like he was a good kid," Alex said. Lila looked at him with a small, complicated expression. "He was," she said. "I hope wherever he ended up, whatever he became, some part of that was still in there somewhere." She picked up a cloth and moved to the other end of the counter. Alex sat with his coffee until it went cold. Some part of that was still in there somewhere. He had no idea if it was. He had not looked in long enough to know. That night, for the second time in a week, he went home without sleeping. The photograph landed on the desk at 7 a.m. Alex looked at it without touching it. A long lens shot, slightly grainy, himself walking out of St. Catherine's front gate, collar up against the November wind. Taken 2 days ago, maybe 3. The angle suggested a parked vehicle on the opposite side of the street, someone with patience and a decent camera and a specific reason to be interested. He looked up at Marco, who was standing on the other side of the desk, with the expression of a man delivering news he'd rather not be delivering. "Where did this come from?" "Vasquez's people," Marco said. "We intercepted it from one of his couriers this morning. It was being sent up the chain." Ramon Vasquez. The name sat in the room like smoke. He ran the East Side operation, distribution, protection, the usual architecture, and had been looking for leverage against Alex for the better part of 2 years. Not brave enough for a direct move, patient enough for an indirect one. Alex set the photograph down. "How many?" "At least 2 vehicles. They've been rotating, so we didn't catch it immediately." Marco paused. "They've been watching the orphanage for 4 days, boss." 4 days, which meant they'd picked up the thread on his second visit, possibly his first, which meant that whatever he'd told himself about being careful, about keeping the visits quiet and professional, hadn't been nearly enough. He stood up and walked to the window. Below, Chicago moved through its morning with complete indifference to the specific problem forming in his office. Traffic, people. A city that had watched worse men than him rise and fall, and had simply continued being a city. "What's their read?" he asked. "Best we can tell, they think the orphanage holds something valuable. Product, maybe. Or documents." Marco's voice stayed even. "They don't know about the girl." Yet, Alex thought. The words settled heavily. "They're assuming the visits are strategic," Marco continued. "That there's an asset there, something worth hitting." Which was, in a way, almost worse than them knowing the truth, because an assumed strategic asset meant Vasquez would eventually move against the building, and when men like Vasquez moved, they moved without particular care for who happened to be in the way. "Double the patrol on the south side blocks," Alex said, quietly, nothing that signals to Vasquez that we've made his surveillance. "Already done." Marco hesitated, a rare thing. "There's something else." Alex turned. The meeting had been called by Dominic Reyes, which meant it was serious. Dom was Alex's oldest lieutenant, 41, methodical, the kind of man who had survived 20 years in this business by treating emotion the way a surgeon treated infection, something to be identified early and removed completely before it spread. He had helped Alex build everything they had. He was also, Alex was aware, the person most likely to say the thing no one else would. They met in the back room of a restaurant on Michigan Avenue, a place that appeared on no public record as having any connection to either of them. Dom was already seated when Alex arrived, coffee in front of him, untouched. Alex sat.
"I'm going to say this once," Dom said, "not to question you, because someone has to say it."
"Say it."
"Whatever is happening with the girl at the orphanage, it needs to stop."
Silence.
"You visited the building 4 times in 6 days," Dom continued. "You've been to her cafe twice. You followed her on foot, in daylight, on a public street."
He kept his voice level, not accusatory precisely, clinical.
"I don't know what the connection is. I don't need to know. What I know is that Vasquez has photographs, and 2 of his lieutenants have started asking questions about St. Catherine's, and our people on the ground are reporting unusual traffic near the building on Halstead."
Alex said nothing.
"She's a thread," Dom said, "and threads get pulled."
It was a reasonable assessment.
It was, objectively, exactly the kind of analysis Alex would have made himself about someone else's situation. He knew that.
He could see the shape of it clearly, the exposed flank, the predictable vulnerability, the way a careful enemy would use something personal to dismantle something structural. He had delivered this exact speech to other men. He had watched those men choose wrong anyway, and had noted it without sympathy. "I hear you," Alex said.
Dom studied him. "That's not the same as agreeing with me."
"No," Alex said. "It isn't."
Something shifted in Dom's expression. Not quite surprise, because Dom was too experienced for surprise. Something more careful than that. "You know what they'll do if they determine she matters to you," Dom said.
"I know."
"Then you understand this isn't about the girl. It's about the signal. The moment anyone in this city believes Alexander Moreno has something he can't afford to lose."
"I said I hear you, Dom." The words were quiet. They were also final.
Dom picked up his coffee, looked at it, set it back down. "Then let me ask you something directly."
"Go ahead."
"Is she worth a war?"
The question hung in the air between them with all the patience of something that knew it would eventually get an answer. Alex thought about a ring rolling across a hardwood floor, a woman who kept wearing it for years not because she expected anything from it, but because it was the only proof she had that someone had once cared. 2 jobs, a small apartment 4 blocks from the only home she'd ever known, a 10-year-old in an uneven pigtails climbing into her lap without asking. Some part of that was still in there somewhere. "That question assumes the only variable is what she's worth to me," Alex said.
"It's not."
Dom waited.
"They're already watching the building," Alex said. "Pulling back now doesn't make her safer. Vasquez doesn't stop surveilling because I stop visiting. He's already curious. The only way she's safe is if I control what happens next."
Dom was quiet for a moment.
"That's a real answer," he said finally. "It's also a convenient one."
Alex almost smiled.
"The best ones usually are."
He drove past St. Catherine's on the way back. He didn't stop, didn't slow much, just enough to register the building in his peripheral vision, the cracked iron gate, the patchy front garden that someone had made a genuine effort with, despite everything, a single light on in an upstairs window. In a parked Toyota 4 buildings down, a man with a phone pretended to be reading something. Alex clocked the vehicle, the plate, the angle, took a photograph on his own phone without raising it, a trick that required a particular kind of stillness and a wide-angle lens setting. Vasquez's people were getting comfortable. Getting comfortable meant they were building towards something. In his experience, that window between surveillance and action was usually measured in days. He drove on. That evening, he sent 3 separate messages to 3 separate people within his organization. Each message contained different instructions. All 3, taken together, formed a perimeter around one specific location on the south side. He didn't tell Dom. He didn't tell Marco what all of it was for. There were things you could explain to your lieutenants, and there were things that existed in a register those conversations couldn't reach. What he felt when he thought about that building, about her, working 2 jobs to stay close to children who had no one, wearing a dead boy's ring without complaint, that was not a thing he could translate into operational language. What he could do was build a wall between her and the things that wanted in. He was very good at building walls.
The question was whether he'd remembered how to do anything else.
The call came at 11:47. Alex was still awake. He'd stopped pretending sleep was coming around the third night of this, sitting at his desk with a city planning document open in front of him that he hadn't read a single word of. His phone lit up with Marco's name, and he answered before the second ring. "St. Catherine's." Marco's voice was tight. "Movement. 3 men, south entrance. They cut the lock." Alex was already standing. "Lila, her light's on, 2nd floor." "Get there." He was already moving. "Now, don't wait for me." She had stayed late. That was the thing that would replay in her mind afterward. The small, arbitrary decision that had put her in the building past 11 on a Thursday night. One of the younger boys, Marcus, had woken from a nightmare and wouldn't settle, and Lila had sat with him until he fell back asleep, which had taken longer than it should have because the nightmare had been about being left somewhere and no one coming back, which was the kind of dream that took time to unknot. She was in the 1st floor corridor, heading for the back door, when she heard the sound. Not loud. That was what made it wrong. It was the specific quiet of people trying very hard not to make noise, which in her experience was always more alarming than noise itself. A scrape. A low voice cut short. The soft displacement of air that meant a door had been opened from outside. She stopped. Her first thought, immediate, physical, before logic caught up, was the children. 12 of them, upstairs, asleep, with only the nightstaff, Mrs. Okafor, who was 63 and had a bad hip and kept a phone in her cardigan pocket.
Lila moved to the supply closet and pressed herself inside, leaving the door open 1 inch.
3 men came through the south corridor, masked. Not balaclavas, just dark scarves pulled up over the nose and mouth, which somehow made it worse, made it feel improvised and therefore less predictable. They were not large, but they moved with the particular confidence of people who had done this kind of thing before and had not yet been given a reason to be afraid of the consequences. The tallest one had a flashlight. He swept it across the walls, the doors, the locked office at the end of the hall. "Storage first," he said, low. "Then the office." Lila's breathing went shallow and controlled. She had her phone in her hand. She'd already dialed nothing, thumb hovering over the screen. If she called police, it would take them 8 minutes minimum. 8 minutes in which these men could go upstairs. She pushed the closet door open and stepped into the corridor.
"This building is occupied," she said.
3 heads turned. She had not planned what she was doing. There was no plan. There was only the 12 children upstairs and the arithmetic of what happened if she stood here and what happened if she didn't. The tallest one took a step toward her. "You should have been asleep." "I should call the police," she said, phone raised. "Put it down." "I'm going to need you to leave." It was, objectively, an absurd thing to say. 3 masked men, 1 woman with a mop bucket 3 feet behind her, and a phone she hadn't actually dialed. She heard it as she said it. She said it anyway, because the door to the stairwell leading up to the children was directly behind her, and the only way to that door was through her, and apparently this was who she was. The man reached forward and grabbed her arm. She twisted, not effectively because she was not trained for this, but enough to make it difficult for him. Enough to pull the lamp from the side table as she fell against it, which made a crash loud enough to wake the building, which was, she realized in the split second before she hit the floor, exactly what she'd been trying to do. Upstairs, a door opened. Mrs. Okafor's voice, sharp and carrying. "Who's there?" The 3 men looked at each other. Then the front door came off its hinges. Later, she would struggle to describe it accurately. Not because it wasn't clear, it was extraordinarily clear, one of those moments that printed itself on memory with unusual precision. It was clear in the way that things were clear when every nerve was paying attention. She would struggle to describe it because the vocabulary for what she saw didn't map easily onto the version of the world she'd been living in. 4 men came through the front entrance, moving fast, organized, no wasted motion. The kind of coordination that didn't come from training, so much as from operating together long enough that communication had become almost physical. Alex was through the door last. The change in the room was immediate and total. Not because of any action. He hadn't done anything yet. It was the way he moved, the particular weight of authority he carried, which in a boardroom or a cafe counter read as composure, and in a dark hallway at midnight read as something else entirely. He looked at the three intruders. "Leave the building," he said. One of them, not the leader, one of the others, someone with less judgment, pulled something from his jacket. What happened next was brief and extremely effective. And Lila, sitting on the floor with her back against the side table, watched it with the specific suspended attention of someone whose brain had temporarily stopped producing commentary and was simply recording. Alex moved. She couldn't have described it better than that. Just moved, direct and without hesitation. And when it was over, the man with the weapon was on the floor, and the other two were being held by the men who'd come in with Alex, and the room was completely still. He turned. He found her on the floor and crossed the room in 4 steps, crouching in front of her. And the face he had while he was doing that was different from any face she'd seen from him yet. Something stripped down to its actual structure, without the composure, without the careful management of impression. "Are you hurt?" "No," she assessed herself briefly. "No, my arm." He looked at her arm. The sleeve was torn, and there was a red friction mark where she'd been grabbed that would bruise by morning. He examined it with focused attention, then looked back at her face. "You stepped out of cover," he said, not quite accusation, something more complicated. "The stairwell was behind me." He looked at her for a moment. "You put yourself between them and the stairwell." "The children were upstairs." Something crossed his face, quick, unmistakable, not surprise exactly. Recognition, the kind of recognition that had nothing to do with seeing a face. Around them, his men had the intruder secured and were moving them efficiently toward the door. Marco was already on his phone. In the stairwell above, Mrs. Okafor was running an increasingly urgent head count. Lila became aware, in pieces, of several things simultaneously. The gun holster visible beneath Alex's jacket, the way his men moved, not like hired security, not like law enforcement, but like something she didn't have clean language for. The ease with which he'd taken apart a man twice her weight. She looked at him directly. "Who are you?" she said. Not the polite version of the question, the real one. He held her gaze without flinching. For 1 second she thought he was going to tell her. "Someone who wasn't going to let anything happen to this building," he said. It wasn't a lie. It also wasn't close to the truth. She pulled her arm back gently, stood up on her own, and looked at the broken front door. "The children are going to come downstairs," she said. "I need you and your men to not be here when they do." Alex steadied her for a moment. Then he stood, straightened his jacket, and nodded to Marco. They were gone in under 2 minutes. Lila stood in the empty corridor, the lamp broken on the floor beside her, the front door hanging open to the cold. Her hands were trembling. She pressed them flat against her thighs until they stopped. Then she went upstairs to check on the children. She called him. That was the part Alex hadn't anticipated. He had left his number with the orphanage administrator weeks ago. Meridian Holdings' contact information, clean and professional. And he had told himself it was for logistical purposes, renovation updates, billing questions, the kind of mundane conduit that justified his involvement without explaining it. At 8 a.m, the day after the break-in, his personal phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. He answered anyway. He always answered numbers he didn't recognize. In his world, the calls that came from nowhere were sometimes the most important ones. "I'd like to meet." Lila's voice, composed, which he suspected had cost her something. "Not at the orphanage, not at the cafe, somewhere public." "Lakeside," he said. "Grant Park. Noon. A pause. Fine. She hung up before he could. November had turned the lakefront gray and honest, the kind of cold that didn't commit to being cruel, but made clear it could at any moment. A wind off the water that cut through jackets and made the few people on the path walk with their heads down and their intentions abbreviated. Alex arrived 10 minutes early and stood at the railing above the lake, watching the water move. He hadn't brought Marco. He hadn't told anyone where he was going. This was the kind of meeting that needed to exist outside his organizational structure entirely, in a space where the versions of himself that ran an empire and made decisions about men's livelihoods and occasionally broke someone's arm in a dark hallway had no jurisdiction. He heard her footsteps on the path before he saw her, that particular efficient pace, and then she was beside him at the railing, close enough to talk, but not close enough to suggest comfort. She looked like she hadn't slept. He recognized the specific texture of that. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The lake did its indifferent thing. A jogger went past without looking at them. "How bad was the damage?" he asked. "The door, one lamp, a chair." She paused. "Mrs. Okafor's nerves. Mine." She said the last two words with the lightness of someone being precise, not casual. "The children are fine. We told them it was a faulty lock. Marcus wanted to know if we were getting a dog." Despite everything, something almost moved in Alex's face. "Are you?" "We can't afford a dog." The wind pushed off the water. She pulled her jacket tighter. "I need you to tell me what's happening," she said. "Not a version of it, the actual thing." "It's complicated." "I know it's complicated. I was on the floor of my corridor at midnight with a man's hand on my arm." Her voice stayed level, but there was steel in the levelness. "Simple things don't produce that." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the water and thought, with unusual clarity, about what was true and what was survivable to tell, and whether those two categories had any overlap. "I fund St. Catherine's," he said. "Have for 3 years, through a holding company." "I'd worked that out." "The people who came last night, they work for a man named Vasquez. He operates on the east side. He's been watching the building because he's been watching me, and he assumed my visits meant the building held something valuable to me." He paused. He was trying to find leverage. Lila turned this over. "And does it? Hold something valuable?" The question landed precisely where she'd aimed it. "The building matters to me," he said carefully. "It always has, for reasons that predate Vasquez and predate the funding arrangement." She was looking at him now, directly, with the particular attention of someone assembling a picture from pieces they weren't sure they had all of. "What reasons?" He turned from the water to face her. This was the edge Dom had described, the place where one more step changed the topography entirely. He could feel it the way you felt a drop in temperature before the storm arrived. Not the storm itself, the announcement of it. "I grew up there," he said. The silence that followed was the kind that happened when something expected finally arrived. Not shock exactly, but the specific stillness of a thing falling into the shape it had always been going to fall into. "St. Catherine's," she said. "Yes." "When?" "Left when I was 14. Before that, most of my childhood." He held her gaze. "I wasn't there under my current name. Things were different then." She was processing. He could see it. The careful, systematic quality of how she thought, working through this new information and rearranging what it meant. Her eyes moved, just slightly, the way eyes moved when the brain was doing something it needed distance to complete. "How different?" she said. "Different enough that you wouldn't have the same name in any record." She was quiet for a moment. "The way you know the building, the corridors, the east wing." She was thinking aloud, not performing it, just doing the thing her mind did. "You knew the layout before anyone showed you." "Yes." "And you've been funding it for 3 years without ever identifying yourself." "Yes." She absorbed this, looked back at the lake. He watched her profile. The particular set of her jaw that he'd come to understand meant she was deciding something. "The people who broke in," she said. "Are they coming back?" "No." "How certain are you?" "Certain enough to stake the building on it." He paused. "Which, I'm aware, is what I'm doing." She turned back to him. "And the children? How safe are they?" "I've put people on the building. You won't see them. They'll rotate. But nothing gets close to that gate without me knowing about it first." "Private security?" He didn't correct the language. She looked at him with that searching expression she sometimes had, the one that felt like she was looking for something specific, something she couldn't quite find the shape of yet. "Why are you telling me this much and not more?" It was exactly the right question. She was exactly the kind of person who would ask it. "Because some of what's left to tell would change things," he said. "For you. I'm not ready to do that yet." "That's not your decision." "You're right," he said. "It isn't." She held his gaze for a long moment. The wind moved between them. "There's something about you," she said quietly. Not to him, almost to herself, the way she'd said it in the cafe that first night. "I can't place it. It keeps happening." She shook her head slightly, the gesture of someone dismissing a thought they can't substantiate. "It feels like, not recognition exactly, more like an echo." The word went through him like current. "An echo," he repeated. "Something familiar that's wearing unfamiliar clothes." She looked at him carefully. "Do you know what I mean?" "I think so," he said, and he meant it in a way she couldn't yet know. She straightened, pushed back from the railing, and looked at the path ahead of her, rather than at him. "I don't fully trust you," she said. "I want to be honest about that." "I know." "But I don't think you'd let anything happen to the building. Or the children." A beat. "I can't explain why I believe that. I just do." "It's accurate," he said. She glanced at him, one last measuring look. "Whatever the rest of it is, whoever you actually are, I need to know eventually. Not now, but eventually." Her voice didn't bend on the words. "Because I don't do well with things that are mostly true." She turned and walked back up the path, hands in her pockets, into the gray November morning. Alex stood at the railing for a long time after she was gone. An echo. She had no idea how precisely she'd named it. He was the echo, the leftover frequency of something that had existed once in that building, clean and uncomplicated, before the world had gotten its hands on it. The question he couldn't answer. The one that had kept him awake for a week, that sat behind every conversation, every careful, calculated half-truth, was whether any of that original signal still existed somewhere in him, or whether what she would find, when he finally told her everything, was only the distortion. He turned his collar up against the wind. Behind him, without either of them knowing it yet, a black car parked at the far end of the lakeside path sat slightly longer than traffic would explain. Inside it, someone made a phone call. "She matters to him," the voice said. "Get her." It happened on a Friday, the most ordinary day of the week, which was perhaps the point. Vasquez was not a dramatic man. Alex had always known that about him. He was a patient, functional man who understood that the most effective strikes happened inside routines, in the gaps where people stopped paying attention because nothing had gone wrong yet. Lila left street. Catherine's at 4:50, same as always. She walked to the bus stop on West Garfield, same as always. The bus was 3 minutes late, which put her at the Halsted Street transfer at 5:19 instead of 5:16. 3 minutes. The length of a song. The time it took to drink a glass of water. It was enough. Alex's phone rang at 5:32. It was Marco, and Marco's voice had a specific quality Alex had heard only a handful of times in 15 years. Stripped of everything except the essential information, the way a voice got when the situation had no room for anything else. "They have her. Vehicle picked her up at the Halsted transfer. Gray panel van. Plates were running now. She didn't get on the bus." The room contracted.
Alex had a man named Griggs mid-sentence across the desk from him, something about a shipping dispute, figures on a page, a problem that had seemed significant 30 seconds ago and now existed in a different universe entirely. Alex stood up without looking at him. "Talk," he said to Marco. "Plates are stolen. Van went east on Garfield, then we lost the signal at the junction near the I-90 on-ramp." A pause. "They're going out of state."
"Indiana. The safe houses Vasquez used when he needed distance." Alex's people had flagged 2 of them during the surveillance sweep last month, one in Gary, one further east near Hammond. Gary was closer but exposed. Hammond was the kind of place that asked no questions.
"Hammond," Alex said. "The Callaway Road property. I'll get eyes on it." "Don't get eyes on it. Get people to it. I want 4 vehicles and I want them moving in 10 minutes. He was already in the corridor, jacket in hand, the Griggs meeting gone from his mind as completely as if it had never occurred. "And Marco, quietly. No sirens, no phones that can be traced, nothing that tells Vasquez we're coming before we're there." He hung up. The drive to Hammond was 47 minutes on a clear highway. Alex sat in the passenger seat, front seat again, which Marco noted and said nothing about. And the landscape changed the way it always did when you crossed out of Chicago, the city releasing its hold gradually, giving way to the flat industrial geography of northern Indiana, the refineries and rail yards and wide sky emptiness that felt like a different country to anyone who'd grown up with Skyline. He didn't speak for the first 30 minutes. What moved through him during that drive was not what he would have expected. He had been in worse situations than this, situations with higher stakes, larger numbers, more complexity. He had navigated them with the flat professional calm that had defined his operation for a decade. This was different. This was the specific, knife-edged fear of having something you couldn't replace in the hands of someone with no reason to be careful with it. He had done this to people. He understood the mechanics of it, the kidnapping as message, as leverage, as a way of communicating to another man that his defenses were not as complete as he believed. He had always operated it as a purely transactional gesture, a language that got things done. He thought about Lila, in a gray panel van on I-90, with no idea what she was caught between or why. He thought about the particular quality of her stillness under pressure, the way she'd stood in the corridor with masked men in front of her and a stairwell behind her and had simply refused to move. She would be frightened right now. She would also, he knew with complete certainty, be refusing to show it. He pressed 2 fingers briefly against his mouth and said nothing. The Callaway Road property was a logistics warehouse that had been genuinely operational once, before Vasquez had acquired the surrounding land through a series of anonymous purchases and made the original owners an offer they'd been wise to accept. From the outside, it looked precisely like what it had always been, a flat-roofed concrete building surrounded by scrubland, visible from the highway if you were looking, invisible if you weren't. Alex's 4 vehicles parked a half-mile out, on a service road behind a fuel depot, at 9:14. He got out and walked to the edge of the scrubland with a pair of binoculars. 2 vehicles at the warehouse entrance, 3 men visible, possibly more inside. The lights were on in the northeast section of the building, the section that, according to the building schematic his people had pulled in the car, had been retrofitted with interior walls, separate rooms. He lowered the binoculars. "Vasquez?" he said to Marco, who was standing slightly behind him. "Not on site. He wouldn't be. He'll be waiting for you to call." "I know." Alex was quiet for a moment. "He expects negotiation." "Yes." "He's going to be disappointed." Marco said nothing. He had worked for Alex long enough to know that this particular tone meant the conversation was over and the next phase had already begun. What happened in the following 22 minutes was efficient, deliberate, and completely one-sided. Alex's people were better than Vasquez's for the same reason that well-run organizations were always better than poorly run ones. Not because they had more resources, but because they operated with cleaner intent. Vasquez's men at Callaway Road were waiting for a phone call. Alex's men were not waiting for anything.
The outer positions were neutralized before the men inside knew there was a problem. Alex came through the northeast entrance himself. He took the interior quickly, room by room, until he found the right one. A retrofitted space near the back, a folding chair in the middle of it, cable ties, a single work light overhead. Lila was in the chair. Her wrists were bound in front of her, which told him Vasquez's men had expected to use her as a display rather than a casualty. Bound but visible, a prop in a phone call that was never going to happen. She had a cut above her left eyebrow, thin and already crusted, that she'd probably gotten during the struggle at the transfer stop. She looked up when the door opened. She saw him. Something moved across her face, not relief exactly, or not only relief, something more complicated than that. The expression of someone who had hoped for a specific thing and received it and was now immediately, even in this moment, dealing with what it meant to have hoped for it. "I knew you'd come," she said. Her voice was steady, deliberately. "Can you stand?" "Yes." She stood before he reached her, which was exactly what he'd expected. He cut the cable ties with a knife from his jacket, and she rolled her wrists once, checking them, then looked up at him. Up close, the cut above her eye was worse than it had looked from the door. He looked at it with the focused attention he'd given her arm in the orphanage corridor. The same expression she was only now, in this moment, beginning to recognize as something that didn't fit cleanly inside the category of professional concern. "You're bleeding," he said. "I'm aware." "There's a kit in the vehicle." She nodded once. Then she looked at the room around them, the chair, the light, the door Alex had come through, and then back at him, at the people visible behind him in the corridor, at the operational precision of all of it. "Alex," she said. It was the first time she'd used his name. "Who are you?" Not the polite version, not the careful version she'd asked at the orphanage, the full, unambiguous version, the question with all its weight. He had been keeping the answer behind a door for 8 days. The door had never felt thinner. "I'll tell you," he said. "I promise, but not here." He looked at the room once more with a soldier's finality. "Not in this place." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she walked through the door ahead of him, out into the Indiana dark, her head up, her hands steady. He followed, and behind them the warehouse sat empty and fluorescent lit and useless. Somewhere in Chicago, a phone rang and went unanswered. Vasquez was waiting for his negotiation. He was going to wait a very long time. They drove in silence for the first 20 minutes. Marco had taken a separate vehicle with the rest of the crew, which Alex had arranged without explaining why. Lila sat in the passenger seat. She'd refused to sit in the back, which he hadn't argued with, and watched the Indiana landscape give way to the distant glow of Chicago on the horizon, a smear of amber and white against the dark sky, the city announcing itself from miles out, the way cities did when you'd been away from them long enough to remember that you'd missed them. She had a bandage above her eye now, applied cleanly in the parking lot outside the fuel depot by a man she'd never met, who hadn't asked her anything, and had worked with the quick, impersonal efficiency of someone who had done this before. She'd accepted it without comment. She'd accepted most of the last hour without comment, which he understood wasn't passivity. It was the specific discipline of someone storing everything up, processing it in careful order, saving the questions for when she had the space to ask them properly. The space was coming. They both knew it. He pulled off the highway at a rest stop south of the city. Not planned, instinct. The kind of rest stop that existed purely as a pause in the middle of somewhere, a handful of lights in a parking lot and a vending machine against a concrete wall. No reason to be there except to stop. He parked, cut the engine, looked forward through the windshield at the concrete wall and the vending machine and the flat dark beyond it. The silence in the car became a different quality of silence, an expectant one. "You're hurt,"
she said, which was the first thing either of them had said since leaving Calloway Road. He looked down. He'd taken a hit during the warehouse entry, a glancing thing, a bad angle, the kind of wound that didn't announce itself properly until the adrenaline stepped back. His left side, below the ribs. He'd been aware of it without registering it as requiring attention. "I'm fine." "You're bleeding through your shirt." He looked. She was right. A dark patch, spreading slowly, below the jacket hem. "It's superficial." "Let me see it." "Lila, you cut my cable ties. Let me see it." He almost argued further, and then didn't, because the look on her face was the same one she'd had in the orphanage corridor, the one that had put itself between masked men and a stairwell. And he had learned, in the last 8 days, that this particular expression was non-negotiable. He shifted in the seat and pulled up his shirt. She leaned across and looked at it in the thin light from the dashboard, a 6-inch gash, shallow but long, still seeping. She pressed 2 fingers gently alongside it, assessing rather than reacting, and he sat completely still. "You'll need stitches," she said. "Not emergency stitches, but stitches." "I know a doctor." "I imagine you know several." She sat back. Her hands were in her lap. "Alex." He looked at her. Her face in the low light was very still. Not the stillness of calm, but the stillness of someone who had arrived at the place they'd been walking toward and was now standing in it, fully, without retreat. "Tell me," she said. "Everything. Right now." He turned to face forward again, looked at the vending machine, the concrete wall, the dark. "I grew up in St. Catharines," he said. "From age 5. My mother left. Nobody came after her." He said it the way he'd learned to say such things, without decoration, without the particular inflection that invited pity, which he had always hated. "I was there until I was 14. Then I left." "I know that part," she said quietly. "What you don't know is the name." He paused. "My name then, before the streets gave me a different one." He felt the shape of what was coming, the sentence that couldn't be unsaid. "I was called Danny Reyes, before Moreno." He heard her breathing change, just slightly, just enough. "There was a girl," he said, "in the year I turned 12. She used to work in the kitchen sometimes, helping with prep. One November, she was upset. Behind the kitchen, by the broken radiator. I found her there." He kept his voice level, not because he felt level, but because leveling his voice was the only form of courage he had available in this moment. "I didn't know what to say. So I gave her something I'd taken from a vendor cart on West Garfield. A ring." The silence in the car was absolute. "A cheap silver one," he said, "too large for her finger, with a scratch on the inside band. I'd made it that afternoon with the corner of a brick because I'd read somewhere that you could engrave metal if you pressed hard enough, and I wanted it to be specifically hers and not just a stolen thing." He paused. "I didn't know how to engrave. The scratch was crooked. It looked like a broken letter." Lila said nothing. He turned to look at her. Her face had done something he hadn't seen it do before. Not collapsed, not broken, but opened. The careful, managed surface she wore as protection had simply come apart at the seams, quietly, the way things came apart when something hit the exact right frequency. She was looking at him with complete recognition. Not of his face, of something older than his face. "You said you'd marry me," she said. Her voice was barely above a sound. "Yes?" "When we grew up." "Yes." Her eyes moved across his face, carefully, the way you looked at a landscape trying to find something you'd memorized from a map, trying to match the memory to the terrain. He watched her find it. The jaw, maybe the eyes,
the particular way he went still when he was trying to hide something. Things a 12-year-old boy and a 40-year-old crime boss had in common, buried under everything the years had built on top. "You left," she said. Not accusation. Fact. "Yes. I thought you were dead." "I know." The two words cost him something. That was easier for me to be for a long time. The boy I couldn't afford to keep him. I needed to become something the street could use. "And this is what you became?" "Yes." She looked at her hands in her lap, at the ring on her right hand, the scratched, slightly too large ring she had worn for 7 years as proof that someone had once cared. "I kept it," she said. "I know." "I wore it every day for 7 years because it was the only evidence I had that I was worth something to somebody." Her voice was steady, but there was a hairline fracture in the steadiness. "I used to tell myself that wherever you were, whatever had happened to you, you'd been real. That moment had been real. That it mattered that you'd sat with me and not asked questions and given me something when you had nothing." He said nothing, because there was nothing to say that was adequate. "And the whole time," she said, "you were here, building—" She gestured at the car, at the implication of the warehouse, at all of it. "This." "Yes." "Did you know, when you came to the orphanage that first day, did you know it was me?" "No." He held her gaze. "I didn't know until the ring fell, the scratch. I'd made it so specifically that I knew exactly what I was looking at the moment I picked it up." He paused. I froze. "I noticed," she said quietly. The vending machine hummed against the concrete wall. Somewhere on the highway, a truck went past. The world was very large and very indifferent and entirely outside this car. She turned the ring on her finger once, the small familiar gesture he'd watched her do 3 times now without understanding it, and now understood completely. "The boy who sat with me," she said slowly, "who stole a ring because he wanted it to be specifically mine, who said something ridiculous about marriage because he didn't know how to say anything else." She looked at him. "Is he still in there?" It was the question she'd asked at the cafe, in another form. The question that had kept him awake for a week. "I don't know," he said. It was the most honest thing he'd said in years. She looked at him for a long time, not with anger, not with warmth exactly, but with the particular expression of someone who has been handed something broken and is deciding, in real time, whether it is the kind of broken that could be repaired or the kind that had simply reached the end of what it had been. Then she turned and looked at the road ahead. "Take me home," she said. He started the engine. They drove north toward Chicago without speaking, and the silence between them was different from every silence before. Not comfortable, not cold, but full. The silence of something that had been named at last and was now simply present, waiting to be decided about. On her hand, the ring caught the dashboard light. It had carried him for 7 years without knowing it. Now it would have to decide what to do with the weight of that. 3 days passed without a word. Alex did not go to the orphanage. He did not go to the cafe. He sent Marco to confirm that Lila had arrived home safely that night. She had, and then he pulled every piece of surveillance from the building perimeter and told his people to stand down, because hovering over her life uninvited was precisely the kind of thing the boy he'd been would never have done. And right now that distinction felt like the only compass he had. He waited. He was good at waiting. He kept telling himself that. It did not help. On the 4th morning, Dom came to the penthouse unannounced. This was unusual. Dom scheduled everything. He believed in the structural dignity of appointments. So when Alex opened his door at 7:15 to find Dom standing there with 2 paper cups of coffee and the expression of a man who had decided something, he stepped back and let him in without comment. They sat at the kitchen table, not the office, not the formal space. Dom set down the coffee and looked at Alex for a moment.
Vasquez made contact this morning, he said. And? He's backing off. Dom turned his cup once. He lost 6 men at Callaway Road. Not dead, but out of operation. He ran the math. A pause. He's requesting a meeting. Neutral ground. He wants to negotiate terms for stepping back from the South Side border. Under any other circumstance, this would have been significant news. A year of tension resolving. Strategic ground gained without a protracted war. The kind of outcome Alex had maneuvered toward for months. He nodded. Set it up. Dom watched him. That's it? What else do you want me to say? I want to know where your head is. Dom's voice was measured, not unkind, because the man I've worked with for 15 years would be 3 moves ahead of this Vasquez meeting right now, thinking about what the step back means for the Eastern distribution network, what it opens up, how to consolidate. He paused. You're not doing that. Alex looked at his coffee. No, he said. What are you doing? He was quiet for a moment, thinking about whether it's possible to take something apart without losing everything you built with it. Dom was still. Not the organization, Alex said quickly. Not quite quickly enough. The parts of it that can't survive daylight. The parts that would... He stopped. Started again. She told me to become someone who deserves it. The sentence sat between them. Dom picked up his coffee. Set it down again. That's a very large sentence. I know. That's years of work. Redirecting capital, restructuring the legitimate holdings, stepping back from arrangements that don't dissolve quietly. A pause. People will read it as weakness. Some of them, the ones who matter most. Then we'll deal with that. Alex looked at him. I'm not dismantling everything overnight. I'm not naive about what this is or how long it takes. But I'm telling you that the direction changes. A beat. I need to know if you're with me on that. Dom looked at him for a long time, the evaluating look of a man taking stock of something he'd suspected was coming and was now deciding whether he'd been right to wait for it. I've been waiting 15 years for you to want something other than more, Dom said finally. I'm not going to argue with the method. He stood, picked up his coffee. I'll set up the Vasquez meeting. He left without finishing the sentence, which, with Dom, meant the answer was yes. She came to the penthouse on the 5th day. He hadn't given her the address. She'd found it. He didn't ask how, because the particular look on her face when he opened the door suggested that she had decided to come and had treated the logistics as a problem to be solved rather than an obstacle, which was entirely consistent with everything he knew about her. She was wearing her work jacket. The bandage above her eye had been replaced with a small, neat plaster. She had the ring on. He opened the door wider, and she came in without waiting to be asked. She stood in the middle of his living room and looked at it the way she'd looked at the orphanage corridor the night of the break-in, registering it, assessing it, not performing any reaction to it. The clean lines, the dark surfaces, the floor-to-ceiling window with the city below it, the absolute absence of anything warm or personal. You live like someone who doesn't intend to stay anywhere, she said. I've been working on that. She turned to look at him. I've been thinking, she said, for 5 days. About you, about that boy, about what it means that you're both the same person. She moved to the window and looked out at the city, the grid of it, the light and motion. I was angry. For the first 2 days, I was angry in a way I didn't entirely recognize. You had the right to be. I know I did. She turned from the window. But here's where I landed. She was choosing her words with the care of someone who had prepared this and was delivering it exactly as she'd prepared it, because it mattered too much to improvise. That boy sat with me because sitting with someone in pain was the right thing to do. He didn't calculate it. He didn't do it for anything in return. He just did it because some part of him, whatever part still existed that the orphanage and the street hadn't reached yet, knew that it was right. She paused. That part is still in there. I saw it at the warehouse. I saw it in the car. I've seen it every single time you thought you were being a hard man and weren't quite managing it. She held his gaze. The question isn't whether it exists. The question is whether you're going to let it run anything. The room was very quiet. I've started making changes, he said. to the organization, to where the legitimate capital goes. It's not fast and it's not clean, and I won't pretend it's finished, or that I'm finished." He paused. "But the direction has changed. I need you to know that it changed because of something real, not because I'm trying to earn something from you." "I know the difference," she said. "I know you do." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she crossed the room and stopped in front of him, close enough that the distance between them was no longer the distance of careful, managed strangers, but something smaller and much more honest. She took the ring off her finger. His chest closed. She held it between them, the cheap silver ring, the scratched inner band, the crooked mark he'd made with the corner of a brick when he was 12 years old and had no language for what he wanted to say. "I wore this for 7 years as proof that the past was real," she said, "that someone had been real." She turned it once in her fingers. "I don't need it for that anymore. I know the past was real. I'm looking at it." She placed the ring in his palm. He looked down at it. "I'm giving it back to you," she said, "because I want you to earn it forward. Not the boy giving it to the girl behind the kitchen, not the crime boss trying to protect the maid." She met his eyes. "The man you're deciding to become, giving it to the person I actually am." He closed his hand around the ring, the scratch pressed against his palm, small, crooked, made with a brick, and no skill by a hungry 12-year-old who hadn't known any better way to say, "You matter." "I'm not going to be quick," he said. "This isn't something I can do quickly." "I know. A beat. I'm not going anywhere. I haven't gone anywhere in 20 years. Something moved across her face. Not quite a smile, but related to one. "That's apparently a thing I do." He looked at her, at the plaster above her eye, at the work jacket, at the absolute, unadorned steadiness of her, and felt something shift in his chest that had been locked in the same position for 17 years. Not open, not yet, but no longer sealed. "The orphanage East Wing," he said, "the renovation. I want to expand it properly. New structure, full rebuild, a genuine facility. And I want it done transparently. Not through Meridian, not through any shell. My name on it." She was quiet for a moment. "That's a significant thing to put your name on." "That's the point." She looked at him with the searching expression he'd come to know, the one that looked for the boy inside the man. And this time, he thought, she found more of him than she had before. "Then you'd better get started," she said. 6 months later, the East Wing of St. Catherine's Orphanage reopened. The ceremony was small, a few staff, the children, 2 city officials who came because the funding was legitimate and significant, and attached to a name that had recently begun appearing in connection with several above-board community projects across the South Side. The press were not invited. Lila had been specific about that. Alex stood in the corridor where a ring had rolled across a floor and changed everything, and watched Marcus, the boy who had wanted a dog after the break-in, run the full length of the new East Wing at top speed for no reason except that the floor was smooth and the hallway was long and he was 7 years old and the world, in this specific moment, was uncomplicated. Lila appeared beside him. "He's going to do that for the next hour," she said. "Let him." She glanced at Alex's right hand, at the ring he'd been wearing on his smallest finger since the night in the penthouse, where it sat too large and slightly crooked, exactly as it always had. She didn't say anything about it. She didn't need to. The ring was no longer about the past. It was not yet entirely about the future. It was about right now. The in-between space where a man who had spent 17 years building walls was learning, one deliberate brick at a time, to build something else. It was not a small thing. It was not a finished thing, but it was, for the first time, a real one.